Welcome everyone. My name is Fadl Kaboub. I teach economics at Denison University in Ohio. And it's my pleasure to welcome you all to this special session celebrating the work of my mentor, friend, colleague, and dear friend, Professor Rajani Kanth. Many of you have worked with him and interacted with him, and that's why I see many beautiful faces here joining us in this special session. We have 2 hours of formal speeches and interactions on this webinar, and then there's probably going to be an additional 30 minutes of unofficial mingling and conversation. So I would be delighted if all of you would join us for the full session. Many of you are coming from so many parts of the world and so many different time zones. So special thanks for those of you who are staying up late or waking up really, really early, which is a telling fact for those of you who know Rajani and his work. We have so many contributors who were not able to join us in person and have sent either written messages or recorded messages. Some are video and some are audio only. I will not do the lengthy introduction of Rajani's work, because so many of you will fill in so many of the gaps, and it's hard to really do justice to Rajani's work in just these 2 hours. So this is just a kind of a little preview, and I would invite those of you who are new to Rajani's work to follow up after this session and really read his work and interact with the literature that he's produced. I'll tell you my story with Rajani in just 2 minutes. I met Rajani for the first time at the ASSA conference, this very conference. I believe in 2001, possibly 2002. At that point, I did not know of Rajani or his work. And it was my advisor, my mentor, Matt Forstater, who's here with us today, who grabbed me by the arm in the hallway at one of the ASSA hallways and told me, there is this panel and there is my friend Rajani Kanth who's speaking on this panel. You need to go see him and you need to listen to his speech. And I went into that session. I remember it vividly. It was a session on heterodox economics, on post-Keynesian, Marxian institutional economics. And at that point, that was, as a grad student, I was fired up about those panels. I was really excited to hear some of the, colleagues who have contributed so much to the literature in these fields. And then Rajani got up to deliver his speech, and he set the room on fire. I've never seen anybody in such a short amount of time deliver so many blows to the economics profession, right, left, and center. And that's the Rajani that I've known since then. But more than his contribution to the literature in the economics profession, political economy, and beyond, Rajani literally wrote the book Against Economics, and I, strongly recommend for those of you who haven't seen his work to at least read his book Against Economics and Against Eurocentrism. Those are some of my favorite works. But beyond that, Rajani became a close friend and a mentor. I've never taken a class with Rajani, but I can do a search in my inbox and you'll see the hundreds of emails probably over the last couple of decades, sometimes daily emails, interactions on so many subjects, on politics, on international relations, on economics, on history, on poetry, beautiful poetry. Some of the most powerful poetry I've read is by Rajani, and I share it all the time on social media. So I wanted to just close my remarks by saying thank you, Rajani, for enriching my life intellectually and professionally and personally And I would like to open up the session for the participants who are joining us today to say a few words. Keep your comments to about 5 minutes, just so we can get through as many of you as possible within the 2-hour limit that we have today. And after that, as I said, we'll have an additional 30 minutes to do informal conversation around the themes discussed today. And I wanted to check here if Professor Wolfram Elsner from the University of Bremen is available live. I wasn't sure if he was going to be here. If not, I do have his recorded message, and I will play it for all of us right here. And
I might just say something. Wolfram wrote to me saying he would like to join, but that's as far as it went. So if he's not here now, then you may have to run you can run the recording.
Okay.
Yes. So I want to make sure here that you're able to see my screen.
Okay. This is my little contribution to this ASSA event celebrating Rajani Kanth's life and work. I make some few remarks on the conception of Eurocentrism, which is a frame for critical analysis of global structures and global change. And I have some more topical thoughts on that, which I would like to present. Now, Eurocentrism is one of Rajani Kanth's major contributions to the scholarly literature. It was the Against Eurocentrism book, 2005. That was a starting point of, I think, several publications on Eurocentrism by him. And I will not summarize or discuss the entire conception and theory of Eurocentrism and criticism of Eurocentrism, nor will I summarize or discuss Rajani Kanth's contribution to it, but rather will give some few very subjective, incoherent thoughts on its topical relevance. Now, during my own academic career, I was not much involved in the philosophical, historical, political debate on the critique of Eurocentrism. Only after my formal retirement, I started working on the more recent global structure and global change, namely decline and rise, imperial decline and the rise of China, namely. I analyzed this in several books recently, 2020, 21, 22, as the rise-decline constellation of the 21st century. And here I came to refer to the Eurocentrism metaphor, an extension, I would say, the Anglo-Saxon imperial hegemony. You can call it values imperialism. It is, in fact, a latent supremacy ideology. One of the major historical puzzles defined in and discussed for long in historical science, historiography, largely solved now, has been the question of how the periphery of the 1,000 years long heartland, Halford Mackinder, 1904, the heartland, the Eurasian heartland, the periphery of it, so the heartland where over many thousands years was the center of global history and the largest countries and economies there. And at the very periphery of this heartland of South Asia, East Asia, Southeast Asia, Central Asia, was Europe. And how could it rise to global dominance while China, which over hundreds of years had been by far the largest economy of the world, a third or more of world GDP, still in 1820 contributed to world GDP, while China could decline, and how could China decline and fall under the European rule, exploitation, and near destruction, the famous century of humiliation in China, still nowadays the term. And that puzzle had been formulated by historian Needham's puzzle, it is called in that science. Now, I will not go into that, nor explain, nor clarify or so, but just some aspects. Europe had, in fact, profited from and imitated, and stolen, in fact, Chinese technologies from the medieval times on, porcelain and iron and steel, textiles, paper and printing, shipbuilding, gunpowder, navigation, medicine, mathematics, etc. And the British particularly were keen and very effective in getting technologies from China over to Europe. And still, in 1820, the Chinese emperor could answer the British upon their request for China to import more from them. The answer was, we have everything and there's nothing of interest for us that you could offer. And that was a kind of particular humiliation for the British. And it was for them the signal to try in different ways, which they knew and had exercised already. It started with opium smuggling from India, and it ended with colonial invasions, a splitting up of the Chinese nation, and a partial genocide. On the philosophical ideological level, it is clear now that racism was a genuine European invention, a colonialist invention, completely unknown in the Central, South, and East Asian history in Eurasia, except from Europe. The entire idea of a European genetic, so to speak, genetic, quote unquote, and value suprematism is a European invention. And the inner target of that was the progressive bourgeois European intelligentsia, which had been enthusiastic about the rich Southeast Asian and Chinese philosophies. And in the second half of the 19th century, racism, in fact, managed to destroy the liberal progressive intellectual traditions of Europe. And particularly, it was the end of European Enlightenment and of bourgeois progressism, particularly in several states as Germany and England or so. The long-term effects of that ended in the 20th century in two world wars, largely motivated by nationalist, suprematist, and racist delusions. Namely, World War II was racist, not only through the Germans, with the identity of communism, Bolshevism, the Slavs, and are subhumans, etc. Similarly, on the Japanese side, against Chinese and Koreans and others. So, final remark from private communication with Rajani Kanth. I'm aware that he is similarly critical to current ideologies of Western supremacy and its related values, imperialism, namely with respect to China and Russia, while himself, of course, stemming from India, from another country that once suffered from that particular ideology. So these were my rather isolated remarks on what I read about Eurocentrism.
Well, this was Professor Wolfram Elsner's presentation. I will ask to the stage Professor Anwar Sheikh from the New School for Social Research. Professor Sheikh, are you with us here? If you could unmute.
Yes, I am. Can you hear me?
Yes, welcome.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here, and honored to have an opportunity to speak about Rajani Kanth, whom I've known for a very long time, and we've remained close and friends, even though not close in a distant sense because of many other things. But so let me start by congratulating Raj on this eminently deserved celebration of his life, his fierce, independent, scholarly, intellectually strong, and deeply rooted sense of not only what is wrong with the world, but what can be made right with the world. This is, if I may say so, even put in the nasty word economics, this is what a political economy should be about, as well as social criticism should be about. Raj started off in my interaction with him by attacking Ricardo for his thesis about trade and resituating it in terms of politics and the convenience of the dominant powers. And then he moved on rapidly to attack economics, and then quickly to attack Western society, and as far as I can tell, pretty much to attack society in general. And I kind of share those steps. I admire him for his absolute power and moral strength in making these arguments. He is, in my estimation, a eminent scholar, an eminent poet, and I have the privilege of reading his poetry, which he sends me, and which either will seldom improve my day, since most of them plunge me into despair and pessimism, but that's a little detail. But also, he's a prophet, and we have to remember that prophecy is a burden put upon you by powers outside of you. You don't choose to be a prophet. And he has borne this weight, this mantle, and it has cost him, as we know, cost him the accolades that he deserves, and which hopefully this is going to be a small part of. But history has its own way of speaking. And the state that we are in terms of the world and in terms of our miserable profession, will hopefully not be the last round. I want to speak very briefly about the central theme, and this is also on a personal note. I started as a graduate student at Columbia in a most apposite time, which was that the strike in 1968. I joined graduate school, like many of us did, and Raj included. We're trying to make a sense of a world that didn't make sense. And we all made the mistake of thinking that economics would help us understand this. And what we quickly discovered is that economics was a mystification as it was being presented by the dominant tradition. And many of us then were led away from it, going back outside of economics, outside of European culture, in Raj's case, outside of the constructions of Westernism. And I ended up also going back, in a sense, to the roots of our understanding of society, because so much in economics is predicated on, in orthodox economics, is predicated on the notion of some intrinsic properties of humans. Their notable selfishness and propensity to truck and barter and all that, which we are repeatedly told. And like Raj and like so many others, this made absolutely no sense as a proposition on which to ground human behavior. So then the question is, where does one go? Raj clearly chose to go back to what he calls the anthropic roots of these conceptions. And in his reading and restatement of these conceptions, he identifies, I won't say a cleavage, but at least a sharp divide between the feminine, the original feminine, the binding feminine, the social feminine, the reciprocal feminine, the feminine that is manifest in family and childcare, in sharing, and the masculine, which he identifies as male-driven, command, warlike, the tendency to create a surplus, that is to, which is of course appropriated unevenly. It's therefore asymmetric. It's an overlordship over others, and adversarial. Now we can recognize these elements as they're embodied. If you'll forgive my wandering off again, I was a student of Gary Becker's, and I remember hearing with astonishment Gary Becker's presentation of the theory of the family. And anybody who's had a family would have to be astonished by such a presentation, but it still dominates our profession and continues to dominate it. So this attempt, I completely share Raj's long-standing attack on the foundations of economics, of Western society and culture, as Wolfram just mentioned about racism. But I also have, in my own readings and wanderings in these same domains of the origins of society and the origins of capitalism, which is, of course, central now to our existence, I don't find myself reading it quite the same way. In my reading, and undoubtedly this is something that would require further discussion of all sorts, is that the transition from tribes, small groups, hunter-gatherer groups, to tribes, to collections, and eventually the critical transformation from tribal groups to agriculture, the appropriation in agriculture, the capability of appropriating a surplus, which is undoubtedly male-dominated throughout of history. And that is then the foundation for civilization. Civilization depending on the ability of this surplus to support a vast structure of overlordships and of those who, like us, who depend on the trickle-down effect of an overlordship. But that led me in a somewhat different direction, which is to argue that the opposition is, and this is a familiar and kind of anodyne Marxist notion, that the development of a surplus is a foundation for a particular form of social structure, and that these social structures have hierarchy and built into them, and unevenly built, of course. Women always in that cleavage, always partitioned, always at the bottom end of it. But of course, we know others, including different races. Like Raj, I'm born in Indian. Unlike Raj, I come from the Muslim side of that history and tradition. And either side, we know how well the powerful history of caste, which is a history that oppresses not only women unequally, most of all, but also oppresses huge masses of people. And this is neither modern nor European. in my opinion, it is civilization. It's the signature of civilization, is the ability to create these enduring and iron barred structures which take a great deal to overthrow. Now, Raj, unfortunately, does not have the advantage or the ability to show us, each one of us, where we're wrong in our wanderings. And this is something, of course, that would be in a different time and place, something that we could be sitting around having good food and good drink and good discussion, which does not imply polite discussion, but at least spirited discussion. I miss that. I miss this opportunity. I hope this event will remind us that this is something that we need to keep doing. And to return to my original theme, Raj is a prophet, and a prophet is always embroiled, always embroiled. That's the nature of prophecy. And for this, I toast him. I applaud him for having the courage to do that, to stick to it, to have not only developed his understanding and his fueling sense of outrage, which is important. You cannot be a prophet if you are happy or if you're comfortable, but also to turn it into poetry, because poetry is also an aspect of prophecy. We forget that. We forget that prophecy comes in hand with proclamations, and poetry is a form of proclamation, sometimes a muted form, sometimes a loudly pronounced form. And he demonstrates what it means to combine the force of outrage, of refusal to accept, with scholarship and with the kind of love that is required to craft things in his writings, but also in his poetry. And these are the elements that we should celebrate here today, not only his intellect, but his being expressed in these different ways. So Raj, again, many thanks for all the years that we've spent glancing against each other, sometimes going the same way, sometimes not, but always, always wonderful. Congratulations.
Thank you. Thank you, Anwar. I'm gonna ask of you, all the participants today, if you could keep to the 5-minute limit. That will get us to actually hearing all the contributions within the time allotted to us. So without any further ado, I'm gonna move on to the next contribution from my colleague Tongyi Ko from Ling'an University. And it's an audio message. It's a wonderful message. I heard it earlier. Can I see thumbs up maybe from Professor Keen, since I see you on camera here? If you hear the sound, just give me a thumbs up. If not, I will see what I can do.
My name is Tongyi Ko, and I'm presently a research fellow at the Center for Cultural Research and Development at Lingnan University in Hong Kong. I regret not being able to join you all in real time today, but feel extremely grateful for this opportunity to honor Rajani Kanth and his work. In the interest of keeping time, I would just like to make 3 points. First, let me begin by saying that I've known Rajani since 1997. That's exactly 25 years ago, around the time that my intellectual journey essentially began. I should say that my meeting Rajani seemed like a matter of destiny. I met him as an undergraduate economics honors student at the University of New South Wales in Sydney, where he had recently arrived as a visiting professor at the economics department. Having been malnourished on a diet of mainstream economic theory in the previous 3 years, I knew very little and was struggling to complete my thesis on technology and employment. And what a struggle it was. I was sitting at my desk for hours, but was very ill-equipped to write. I was discovering that very little of what I had learned in economics had prepared me to understand the real world. Through my struggles, I was beginning to realize that economics I learned was a kind of willful institutional mystification about the world. At this point, I saw posted on the department's notice board a flyer about Rajani's new book, Against Economics. Of course, this was rather timely given my circumstances, and so I proceeded to locate him to arrange a meeting. In hindsight, what transpired after that meeting has been nothing short of life-changing, for better or worse. I would like to think that it was for the better, but let me come back to that. This brings me to my second point. I'd like to acknowledge the great intellectual debt I owe Rajani. Although I've never been formally taught by Rajani, I think it would be safe to say that if it were not for the influence of his ideas and work, my academic and intellectual life would have ended with my undergraduate degree in economics. And I would have proceeded to work in finance, banking, insurance, or some other domain of predatory rent seeking. But instead, I became a scholar, an activist, again, for better or worse, an issue I'll come back to. To be sure, my knowing Rajani meant that I was exposed to an alternative body of ideas, ideas which mainstream society tends to be extremely antagonistic towards. Now, as most of you know, Rajani's work long ago transcended the insular discipline of economics, and his work has been transdisciplinary in the broadest possible sense, featuring social critiques of patriarchy, colonialism, racism, modernism, Eurocentrism, and more. I have no doubt that it was because of the influence of his wide-ranging critiques that I have sought to become a transdisciplinary scholar over the past 2 decades, proceeding from my bachelor's in economics to getting a master's in political economy, then a master's in sociology in the US, a PhD in cultural studies in Hong Kong, then finally a PhD in social anthropology in London. My third and final point. I mentioned my uncertainty about whether the influence of Rajani's work has been for better or worse. I'm only half joking when I'm saying that the influence of his work could have been for the worse. For the reality we are living is a farce, whereby ignorance seems more like a blessing. In such a world, ignorance is indeed bliss. The less one knows, the better. For this reason, I note that while Rajani's work inspired me to become educated and to become more self-aware, I'm not sure if that's an asset in the age that we live. As many of us know, Rajani's uncompromising social critiques have always presented inconvenient truths that society's gatekeepers often find too difficult to accept. As a precarious intellectual laborer, I understand fully well the consequences of being too critical, of speaking inconvenient truths. One gets punished when refusing to stay within the disciplines, and life becomes extremely difficult. So I'm only partly joking when I say I'm uncertain about whether Rajani's influence has been for the better. But that's merely one rather functionalist way of looking at the matter. Perhaps offering critical analysis and speaking inconvenient truths is and has always been the intellectual's social responsibility. Perhaps reality is the farce it is today exactly because too many who should know better choose to remain silent to avoid the inconveniences being critical may bring. On this front, Rajani cannot be accused of such an abdication of intellectual and social responsibility. As the colonial matrix relentlessly punishes and traps those who attempt to defy it, he stubbornly persists as one of the minority who still dares to think. For that, and especially for that, thank you, Rajani, and congratulations.
Well, that was our colleague Tongyi Ko from Lingang University. Without any further ado, I'd like to ask my friend and colleague, Dr. Matt Forstater, to speak for, again, less than 5 minutes, please. Matt, the floor is yours.
Congratulations. And this is a well-deserved celebration of Rajani Kanth's life and work. I heartily agree with so many of the sentiments that have been expressed. And yeah, I just can't say enough about the tremendous influence. I think really Tung Yi and Anwar, really everybody who spoke already has said, you know, so much of, I mean, I can remember back when I was just introducing myself, I had heard about Rajani from my teachers at the New School, and even some of his papers from his dissertation were circulating around the department. And of course, even in those days, there were strong feelings of that were invoked by these early papers on Ricardo, which might have been his first book, but then came a series of books, Breaking with the Enlightenment, Against Economics, Against Eurocentrism, that expressed and put together really his unique thought. And I think it's, you know, the sacrifices that he has made, and it's just another sad reflection on our discipline that you know, that Rajani's work and contributions have not been, you know, recognized more widely. And that's why I think it's important for us to include his works in our courses, introduce our students, and so on. So poetry has been mentioned, and I'd like to finish with a poem. And so, in that flash rebounded ringing, the cartwheels, the Ferris wheels, to jitterbug the blackness, held the opium wound wide at the breast and breathed into it, to sink, to take a powder, hides flat up against the grain of the wood, ungnashed the teeth, we his rude chucking shoe throb of bling bling, my doughy fiber strings elasticized in gumbo, violoncello, rosin, my holy scrub-a-dub on the backside, up beat down this tongue, and what we all will be, will swung in this lifetime, in this one. Red cells, white cells, a Pegasus hemoglobin, this X-ray vision of Pollyanna from the moon. There's a piece of salt stuck in the root of my tooth. Tried to slit my throat with a saxophone reed. I said my Joey was ready and waiting. The street was poured out of the mouth of the moon. Drop of milk on the lip from the nipple. My luck dripped out of the ladle. Worship the maybe save grace for later. The deeper your diaphragm holds a green quarter note. It's a seed that knows a crib when it lies in one. Lays there, stays there, melting its easy to the root of that moan. Just a scoured hour in the ash of a teapot, just a merely smile on the wings of your dogma, just a brave threat in the face of twisted histories, just a bad egg in a strange room, just a gauzy veil of ulterior motives, just a double meaning in the blinking of an eyelid, in the passing of a millisecond, in the ascension of a planet, in the saga of a solar system, another story, another detail, another bail me out, SOS, help. Another fire in the movie house, assassins on bastard welfare, sucking European etiquette through plastic straws. In that flash rebounded, bringing the cartwheels, the Ferris wheels, to jitterbug the blackness, held the opium moon wide the breast and breathed into it, to sink, to take a powder. Hides flat up against the grain of the wood, ungnashed teeth, we his rude chucking shoe throb of bling bling, my doughy fiber strings elasticized in gumbo, violoncello, rosin, I scolded, scrubbed up on the backside, up beat down this tongue, and what we all will be, will swung in this lifetime, in this one. Congratulations, Rajani.
Fantastic. Thank you.
Thank you, Matt. This was wonderful.
Wonderful.
I would like to go to the next recorded message that I have here from Professor Asad Zaman. from the Pakistan Institute of Development Economics, and the recorded message is only a voice message. So I'm going to ask my friend again, Steve, to give me a thumbs up if you hear the sound.
I would like to take this opportunity to present my tribute to Rajani Kanth, fearless warrior for females, families, and tribes against Eurocentric modernity. His insights are of extreme importance for understanding and shaping the world we live in today. We start with a quote from one of his papers, that even though Eurocentric thought is the cause of most of the problems, it actually dominates the world and is thought of as the solution. In a famous experiment carried out in Germany in the 20th century, scientists put a pair of inverting glasses on his assistant, which caused him disorientation because it made the world appear upside down. But after a while, he got adjusted to this and he started seeing world correctly again. And this is exactly what has happened as a result of the global conquest by the Europeans in the early 20th century. It created a superiority complex in Europeans and an inferiority complex in the rest of the world. Rajani's work is a powerful antidote to this toxic Eurocentric narrative that the conquest of the globe was a civilizing mission of Europe to savages and barbarians inhabiting the world. Rajani proposes the opposite, that European savages and barbarians have wiped out civilization from the planet Earth. I find it useful to think of Rajani as expansion and explanation of Gandhi's brief and pithy remark about Western civilization. So impossible to cover the scope of Rajani's work, so I will just focus sharply on one point that I consider, that I find most important, and that is the idea that economics is really the religion of modernity. And once we understand it this way, it is a belief system. It has nothing to do with what it claims to be a science and aspect of knowledge. Some of the key elements of the economics religion is that our life is about maximization of our pleasure, and that all is fair in pursuit of pleasure, power, and profits. We live in a jungle of cutthroat competition governed by greed, individualism, hedonism. So this toxic message requires a counter, which Rajani has provided, that basically the central sources of our pleasure are social groupings, family, kinfolk, and tribe. And the basis of good character is the feminine aspect. And the important realization is that actually today, this is the central religion of all mankind. There are no Muslims or Jews or Christians or Buddhists left. Everyone is, except for a very small minority, everyone has been trapped by the matrix of this religion. The solution that Kant proposes is that we must learn to be authentically. There is no need for violence, no need for to storm the bastions of capitalism. If we just learn to recognize the inner human being in us and behave authentically, we can simply, modernity will collapse on itself. Extrapolating from the roots that Kant provides, we wish to reconstruct the entire structure of human knowledge. Eurocentric ways of knowing the world are toxic and they must be replaced. I have my own efforts in this direction in the development of Ulumul Umran, which is the knowledge of living together in groups based on Ibn Khaldun. And basically this corresponds to the tribal society model put forth by Kanth. To conclude, I would just like to thank Rajani for his extraordinary work, and he has substantially expanded the range of what we can say and what we can think, and for this, we are all grateful to his life of effort in this direction.
That was Professor Asad Zaman. Up next on my list here, Genevieve Vaughn from the International Feminists for a Gift Economy in Italy. If you, the floor is yours. I see you already. Yeah.
Yeah, thank you very much. I'm very happy to be here to celebrate Rajani, who has been a friend of mine now for about 4 years, I guess. And I've been very happy to know him. I first saw a commonality between my work and Rajani's when I listened to his speech at the World Peace Congress, which he ended with the call, "Let Women Lead." I had co-authored a paper with that title for the UN Decade for Women final conference in Nairobi many years earlier. But I thought it was extraordinary that an academic man, an economist, would issue that call at a peace conference that he had organized. Later, I found out that his opinion of women was based on an idea of their genetic superiority, which I have been at pains to show, while I have been at pains to show the psychological, social, and economic underpinnings of gender differences. I propose a maternal gift economy, which has as its ideological superstructure the paradigm of communication and community that is now being plundered by patriarchal capitalism. Since I have thought and hoped that in spite of these differences, it might be possible to bridge between the two camps and between the disaffected of patriarchy inside and outside academia and the proponents of matricentric feminism, among whom I find myself, to create a common front with the common analysis that could liberate many people from the pernicious and false worldview that patriarchy and capitalism have engendered in the last centuries. This bridge could be useful in creating the deep and widespread changes necessary to step back from the brink of disaster and to find the path to a humane and peaceful future, together with a healed Mother Earth and her children. When Rajani talks about feminine hospitalities and the feminine principle, I think of my own maternal gift economy model based on the logic of unilateral giving outside the constraint of quid pro quo. I am more hopeful than he is because in spite of the enormous difficulties, it is easier to change an economic mode than the genetic code. If men were genetically destined to hierarchy and power, I would be as negative about things as Rajani is about the state of the world. However, in my work, I have tried to show that the model of unilateral giving that is necessary for the survival of children in infancy maintains the existence of a relational gifting economy, whatever the gender of the child and whatever circumstance of the big picture may be. I believe that this economy and its implications of value continue to influence us throughout our lives, even though they are now undermined and overwritten by patriarchal capitalism. From this point of view, it seems to me that the maternal gift economy in ontogenesis recapitulates in the here and now the phylogenetic trajectory of anthropic human existence, which has been eliminated by the various stages of his story, culminating in terminal Euromodernism. The modern infant, who in the beginning necessarily lives in a gift economy, later has to adapt to an economy of quid pro quo exchange where almost nothing is free. Both of these anthropic ways of being the tribal economy, and the economy of maternal care have been demeaned, defeated, and exploited by the economy and the ideology of patriarchal capitalism and its Euro-modernist expressions. Nevertheless, they continue to exist to some extent within the family and in some remaining indigenous societies, which are now trying to reclaim their heritage. My hypothesis is that they remain everywhere in a gift paradigm that has gone underground and it has never been completely lost, but is hidden, unrecognized, and misused. My hope is that we can access this paradigm and restore it so as to find our way out of the end of the world scenario in which we are living. Here is something I hope Rajani may accept as a positive gift. Rajani appeals to the idea of a society of conviviality. Perhaps he does not know that there is a group of international academics and activists who have gathered around French sociologist Alain Caillet, the creator of the Revue du Mos, Mouvement Anti-Utilitariste des Sciences Sociales, to write a manifesto of convivialism, now signed by hundreds of committed people. Let me just mention the general convivialist principles from the second 2020 version of this manifesto. The principle of common naturality, by which they intend human interdependence with nature, principle of common humanity, principle of common sociality, principle of legitimate individuation, principle of creative opposition that allows rivalry for the common good. And last but not least, the imperative of hubris control, which seems to me an attempt to temper some of the worst defects of patriarchy. And I'll just read you the description of the imperative of hubris control. The first condition for rivalry to serve the common good is that it be devoid of desire for omnipotence, excess, hubris, and a fortiori pleonexia, the desire to possess evermore. On this condition, it becomes rivalry to cooperate better. This principle of hubris control is in fact a meta principle, the principle of principles. It permeates all the others and is intended to serve as a regulator and safeguard for them. For each principle, pushed to its extreme and not tempered by others, risks being reversed into its opposite, the love of nature or that of abstract humanity into hatred of concrete men. The common sociality in corporatism, clientelism, nationalism, or racism. Individuation in individualism, indifference to others. The creative opposition in the struggle of egos, in the narcissism of the small difference, and in destructive conflicts. So at least one group of people is trying to create a change in our society towards conviviality. So I want to celebrate Rajani and thank him very much for all of the kindnesses he's showed towards me and all the very interesting ideas we have discussed.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. Up next, I would like to ask Dr. Solomon Namala to join us. If you're on camera, please go ahead and unmute from Cerritos College. Solomon, are you with us?
Yeah. Yes, thank you. I wasn't expecting to speak here. I did write something to you, but I will say a few words. I've known Rajani for over 30 years. I'm going to speak to him about him as a person. All of you have talked about his intellectual work. Rajani was my dissertation advisor at the University of Utah. I graduated in 1994 and I met him in 89 and I've been in touch. He's been my mentor and I'll say I would not be where I am today without Rajani's help as a human being, as a scholar. He gave me the, even at a heterodox department, a Marxist department like University of Utah back in the early 90s, he gave me the space to explore and work in areas that was not even acceptable within a heterodox economics department. Mine was a post-structuralist and post-colonial critique of development economics inspired by Edward Said and subaltern studies, Spivak and Foucault. But Rajani was the one who gave me the space to do that. And I went through many hard times in those early days, even personally, but he was there as a friend, as a mentor. And I just want to thank you, Rajani. I would not be where I am without your help and friendship. Thank you.
Thank you so much. And without any further ado, I'd like to ask our guest of honor today, Professor Rajani Kanth, to say a few words. Rajani, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Pado. Thank you, everyone. The tide is high. COVID, climate change, threat of global war, nuclear annihilation. The doomsday clock says it all. Have a look. That's where we stand today, lest we forget. Economics is not a science yet. It could be if it were ever serious. But being a top-notch shill for the system makes it a non-starter. But it's actually far more than that. It's a vital plank, nay, a crown jewel, in the legitimation of Euro-modernism, which is the kind of modernism that Europe invented prior to imposing it on the world at large. And which is why it gets this gratuity of a Nobel Memorial Prize. It is also pretty bankrupt as disciplines go, can neither explain nor predict reality, imagine that. But it does serve perhaps a more important function or two, helps maintain the system, and provides a livelihood for ever so many. My work titled Against Economics provides some more background. Now, I take the route of transcendent critique rather than engaging in immanent debates. I charge all of our global debacles to Euro-modernism, which I'll now abbreviate as EM. COVID, climate change, the nuclear threat are all singularly EM creations. If EM did not exist, they would not exist, and that is the truth. We live in an EM world, whether European or not, since globally, we're all Euro-modernists now, unfortunately. Yes, Europe, that is its governing elites, has much to account for. Besides looting the world willy-nilly, whilst proclaiming high idols, its enlightenment stood received anthropic values on their head. Be it asocial individualism, an innovation in its own right, or its vulgar algorithms of progress, in all those regards, it stood all of received history on its head. The true scarce resource is neither time nor money, but love. You see, EM doesn't have a clue as to who we are really as anthropic beings. We could learn far more by simply observing our cousins, close cousins, chimps and bonobos instead of European social science. It forgot we are animals, mammals to be accurate, heat-seeking, not light-seeking. Our highest need may simply be to huddle. Compare that prosaic reality to the wild and woolly utopias and idols EM has deluged and deluded us with. No wonder they all flopped. You might see EM as an attempt to perforce convert mammals into reptiles. That is the real class struggle today. Liberty, equality, and democracy, the holy mantras of EM, have little to do directly with our real anthropic needs, which are food, clothing, shelter, but even far, far more, care, consideration, and conviviality. To be true to our essence and to be in tune with it, we might try to cogitate less and feel more, embracing a state of being rather than endless mandatory doing and becoming. That's it in a nutshell. Need I say more? If we should topple EM in total, the planet has a chance. If not, my two works that attend to these issues are Breaking with the Enlightenment and Farewell to Modernism. Now, I don't much care for disciplinary bounds. Been into open thinking most of my life. There's no school anywhere that encourages that. The university system does not open minds, but rather seals them shut once duly filled with authorized ideas. EM disciplines break reality into bits, so we elide the big picture. In fact, EM social science arose initially to stave off revolt after the French Revolution. And that's the way you do it. Chop knowledge into little bits, keep them apart, and no one's the wiser, especially the downtrodden. I visited Harvard in the departments of English, economics, anthropology, and history. I overstayed, or I'd have gone on to political science and sociology also. So I ask you now, what's in a name? I must say, having sampled the academy now in the United States, the UK, Germany, Denmark, Singapore, Australia, and India, that I've never encountered a school as rich in raw, cross-disciplinary talent as JNU, Nehru University, India's national university, where I started my teaching life at the senile age of 22, graduating from the Delhi School of Economics. As I still see it, I started at the very top, then worked my way zealously downwards. Haven't hit the bottom yet. How's that for devolution? JNU was paradise. I'm sure what it's like now. I rue the day I left it for New York City, and in particular Columbia University. The new school gave me moderate sanctuary, thanks to Paul Sweezy and Robert Halbrenner, but the experience was not sanguine. By the way, the joke ran that the new school gave you a 14th Street education at Fifth Avenue prices. Now, this was the obverse of the motto that existed prior to this school in that building. It was a shoe store. I'll let you figure what that motto might have been. Having taught graduate school for 3 years, to pretend to be a student again was unedifying, especially since, arrived a sociologist, I was shape-shifting into an economist. Besides, I had actually come hoping to be teaching there, owing to a meeting with the late Stephen Heimer in India, but tragically he died but days before my arrival. What sustained me was a UN appointment as advisor to the UNFPA, but New York City back then had me in revulsion. I'm still biased. Even now, I avoid changing planes at JFK. By about the age of 18, I had construed the way the societal world, i.e. station society, works. I'll spell it out. In all post-tribal societies, no more than about 200 families appear to run everything, regardless of system. And in all such entities, small cabals of men corner power and call themselves the state. That's the alpha and omega of it. After that early assessment, I simply couldn't get serious about things. So much of modern society is outright sham that one can only turn off. I took to theater, to music and writing instead. I wish I'd stuck to that. But years later, 2 of my screenplays were pirated and produced successfully by Hollywood. But I took up social science, as big a fall as can be imagined. All one can do in that world is to post endless critiques of a system built on adroit fakery. You start out noting that this is wrong and that is wrong until the day you realize it is all wrong. Besides, nothing ever happens in it, so one chews the bitter cud forever. You see, devoid of realist anthropology, EM dreams up a concocted economics, sociology, etc., etc., etc. Take microeconomics. It is not a description of reality. It's a prescription for reality. It is how they wish the system works. It is what they want you to do. So it's a bit like theorizing chemistry and biology, knowing nothing about physics. My work titled Against Eurocentrism breaks that dreary mold, offering a new vision. When Halbrenner read my drafts, he said wryly, I should arrange like him to be independently wealthy first, before writing in such direct fashion. I'm still working on that. He was right. The Academy took care not to notice my work, so I went globetrotting. Perhaps no one has ever served as many schools, but I was held in esteem by a few. Roy Bhaskar, Chomsky, Paul Sweezy, Robert Halbrunner, Emmanuel Wallerstein, Amit Goswami, the physicist, the late Jeff Harcourt, Gayatri Spivak, Vandana Shiva, Paul Feyerabend, all trailblazers. The last particularly was almost an alter ego. My students also to a fault, made it worthwhile. Australia, Denmark, and Singapore were great. Australia was wonderful. People like the late, great Jeff Harcourt, John Ludovic, Steve Keen, and students whom I know still years later, like Melanie, Tracy, and Tungi. Singapore was hot and sticky, but their national university was extremely kind to me, and I enjoyed my graduate students. Denmark, our host, was lovely. The cold didn't bother me. There was a stark Spartan ethic to it that I enjoyed. The students were terrific. They, like their professors, came into class at 9 in the morning with open beer bottles. I wish I liked beer, but I don't. But given the hidebound Anglo-American culture we inhabit, it was all a breath of fresh air. Even their mild Viking chauvinism was tolerable. And now to give thanks to all attending this function, but particularly Dr. Kabul, our host, amongst the most talented and active political economists I know in his age group. Also, ethical and moral as befits the received cultures of Arabic before petroleum. Apart from those represented here, I must pay tribute to some others who offered me support across the years. Jocelyn Morin, who edits the Harvard Square editions, Sam Dunn, professor at the University of Utah, Noam Chomsky, Rabbi Janet Daly, a female rabbi in England, Tracy Lee from Australia, Nancy Nash, UMass, Vijay Lakshmi Nanda, she is principal of Miranda House, a famous college in Delhi, Kathy Hawkins, a psychologist from Utah, and Dr. Jean Fuller, also a medic here. Gwyn Loftus and Julia Merry of the AEA helped beyond any call of duty in organizing the session. And thanks to Diane Weidenkopf covering the technical end of this right now as I speak. More personally, to my ex-fellow travelers, Shika and Corey, and my cousin Vikram. But finally, to give thanks to my own chorus of daughters, Antara, Indrina, Malini, and Anjana, in that order of appearance. They keep me almost literally alive. The tide is high. Will the world survive the crises I've named? By that I mean, will we survive them? We all know we stand at the brink. Now, I believe there's a small chance that we will, and that vests not in us, but in the nature of the universe. You see, my perusal, I can't claim to study it, I don't know enough, of quantum physics and the Vedas suggests that the universe possibly preens itself through us. So I ask you, where is the exhibitionist without its voyeur? In effect, I'm hoping the vanity of the universe exceeds our own hubris. If we know not why we are here, although I believe I just provided a clue, we can invent our own canons. Here's mine. The true measure of life is not our accumulations of achievements and accolades, such as you're all giving me generously, but how much and how deeply we have loved and are loved in return. That, to me, is the meaning and measure of our existence. In that accounting, to be in deficit is no great dishonor, but perhaps even a mark of grace. At any rate, mine has been a life filled with precisely such a chronic and still accumulating deficit, but I don't mind it. You see, my late Victorian Brahmin mother, Kesari Kannepalli, by far the most significant and indelible influence in my life, would have seen it this way. In fact, she might have said it. There's no adversity so dark as may not be made bearable with a good, strong cup of tea. I used to scoff at her then, but now I tend to agree. Thank you all. I'm sincerely grateful to each of you for honoring me as you have. Thank you.
Thank you, Rajani. This is wonderful. Up next, I have my colleague, Lynn Paramore from the Institute for New Economic Thinking. Lynn, if you could go ahead and unmute, you're up next. I saw Lynn earlier. There you go.
Am I unmuted?
Yes. Welcome.
Yes. Well, it's absolutely my pleasure to be here. I met Rajani several years ago after I read his wonderful book, which helped me understand how trapped we have become in a mindset in which there doesn't seem to be any alternative from ideas inherited from the Enlightenment. And he really helped me personally to break out of that framework. And it was very exciting to share his work with our students at the Institute for New Economic Thinking, as well as our colleagues. And I feel like his work is part of an exciting and fresh and dynamic continuum of work, perhaps the most latest from the late David Graeber and his colleague, David Wingrove, who also have encouraged us to shake off our inherited mindsets and remember what the most powerful things that make us human are: our connectivity, our experiences of joy, our altruism. That's something that Rajani points out, and Genevieve's work also has been very helpful for me in seeing human potential at a time when it looks like humanity is on a pathway to crash, burn, or fade away in lonely isolation. We need voices like Rajani's more than ever to sustain us, to encourage us to be bold in our thinking, and to remember what really makes us human, and to realize that we don't need to be dominated by the tyranny of ideas that we have inherited in the West, or tyrants in general. So thank you very much, Rajani, for your work. I'm always looking forward to the next manifestation. Thank you.
Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you, Lynn. Up next on my list here, I have Dr. Sudhir Sopuri, former Vice Chancellor of JNU in India. Professor, are you able to?
Yes, I'm around. I'm around. I'm very happy to join this session, which is celebrating Rajani and his work, friend of ours. Rajani, as he mentioned, he joined Jawaharlal Nehru University after finishing his studies at Delhi University. And it was around that time in 1973 that I also joined that university as an assistant professor. So two things in common between us, the two universities, JNU and DU. In fact, I see Sudipta Kaviraj also here, the audience, who was also from JNU one time. I actually came in contact with him when he visited our university when I was the Vice Chancellor there. I attended his public lectures. I was so impressed with his presentation and his critical views on Eurocentrism, modernism, and humanism that we actually invited him to spend more time in the university as fellow of the Institute of Advanced Studies. And at that time, he delivered a lot of lectures to the students. And I used to organize my schedule in such a way that I could attend his talks. Later on, I read his book, not too much, on general, The Farewell to Modernism on Human Devolution. As a scientist, I'm a plant biologist. We all read about human evolution, but this was a different concept coming from a different perspective. Though our fields of studies have been very different, mine being biologist, and he's a social economist, has worked in great detail. But there was something about his talks that I was driven to those talks, that I would like to attend and learn something from his theories and his concepts. Lately, during the pandemic period, I was even impressed with his knowledge, I think, which he had gained about biology, the field of virology. He would ask me questions about how these viruses replicate and how these vaccines really function, his views on climate change, his views on cancer biology, and so on and so forth. And I found he is so sharp that he could grasp the broad dimensions of these subjects also. In his thinking and thoughts, I think Rajani is very different from many others. And I like the name of his email, Involute Gandhian. His theories maybe not been tuned with the general acceptance of the majority, but these have a logic. More than his core subject, which I do not have any expertise, as I mentioned, I'm a biologist, to comment on, I find his poems and writing, which I get on very regular basis in my email, very thought-provoking. Sometimes I wonder how can one person write almost on weekly, daily basis. In fact, I've kept all his emails and all his poems in one folder. I just quote a few of them quickly from Midnight Sonata. They say in the heart of night, the light of spirit glows. From veil of grief, nature is weary of time, as I with the idle rhyme, an era is passing on, ere long will all be gone. And on friendship, we have friendship, Rajani, for a long time now. He says, friendship that is wanton and droll, friendship that touches the soul, friendship that sticks on like glue, friendship that evances like dew. Rajani, let our friendship continue. I wish him good health and more wisdom, knowledge, and let the world know that there is a different view, a more logic view to understand the consequences of economic development in the West. I continue to keep me on your mailing list and enlighten us with your writings as always. God bless you. It was so pleasure to be part of this session. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Sudhir.
Thank you very much. Up next, I have Professor Steve Keen, who's joining us really early morning, I presume, from Thailand, I believe. Steve, the floor is yours.
It was going to be Thailand, it's now Sydney, so it's much more respectable hour. So I'll be as brief as I can here. I've seen in Rajani's work the outsider's perspective, looking at the beast on the inside, and it's a marvelous contribution because he has no patience with the nonsense that neoclassicals and Americans in general describe their very one-dimensional view of a one-dimensional world in which we do not live. I often think of the novel Flatland, if you know that novel where one-dimensional creatures live in a two-dimensional surface and can't understand the second dimension. And that pretty much describes America, and it certainly describes neoclassical economics. So my perspective has been similar, but it's slightly different. I've been the outsider standing on the outside, looking at the inside, thinking, how the hell do you not see the world you live in? And a term that I coined right back in my youth was that the sense of parochiality to empire. An empire regards the rest of the world as its backyard. When something goes wrong there, it regards what's happening in there as a weed to be pulled out to make the garden look perfect again. And there's a particularly painful example of that for me as an Australian happening right now and happening for the last decade, the treatment of Julian Assange. I find it simply bizarre that an Australian citizen is being prosecuted in English legal system for breaking an American law. What on earth is going on? And that can only be explained because the empire sees itself as the planet, the rest is a reflection. And what's wrong with applying American laws to other citizens of other countries living in other countries? I think there'd be various laws we could choose the same way and reply them back, Rajani. It'd be quite a bit of fun. Let's find some nice Indian or Pakistani examples to apply and see how Europeans and Americans enjoy that. And the best satire I've seen of that actually came from Ecuador, which of course overlaps with Julian. When Rafael Correa responded to America's request to re-establish its military base there, he said he'd be quite happy to do it as long as they agreed to having an Ecuadorian military base in Florida. And of course, it was total, what are you talking about? That's incomprehensible. But that's exactly in reverse what America's been doing to the rest of the world. I'll end it there. Congratulations on being celebrated for your contributions to parodying and ridiculing this one-dimensional view of the world when you're sitting inside the most one-dimensional part of it, which is the American Social Sciences Association. So congratulations. I'll finish on one final note, and that is we need continuity. You and I have helped bring many young students to see the world differently. I have to say, of all the youngish people that I see working right now, and my apologies to people who are here, I'm not going to mention, my number one nomination for people to take a look at the work of would be Blair Fix, because his work is fundamentally empirically based and has given a new vision that I hadn't seen myself. So I would see the contributions we're all trying to make. The one, if you haven't heard of him before, please check out the work of Blair Fix, and hopefully we can continue bringing realism to this fantastical world of economics.
Thank you, Steve. Wonderful. Up next on my list here, I have Professor John Hobson coming to us. Okay, John, I see you on the screen. The floor is yours.
Thanks, Fadil. And well, truly, I'm honored to be here on this panel. Thank you so much, Rajani, for inviting me. I had the pleasure of introducing the audience to the conference, World Peace Congress conference back in 2007. I remember Fadil in particular from there, where I discussed his key book, or probably one of his most important books, Against Eurocentrism, which of course has been mentioned quite a few times already. And that was when I first met Rajani, and I was taken by his charismatic personality, very quietly spoken on the one hand, but an ability to provide penetrating and unrelenting critique of all things Western that are all too often taken for granted by lay people, as much as, sadly, academics. As we know, Rajani's interests and passions are wide-ranging. He's worked for the UN. He is highly multidisciplinary, works in a whole bunch of areas, too numerous to mention here, all of which, as we've heard in his, frankly, that was a wonderful talk that he just gave in that 10-minute slot, all of which leads him to reject the particularism, the parochialism of monoglot disciplines, all separated down disciplinary lines, often policed by the most draining methodological, puritanical beliefs that maintain their separationism. 18 years on since the publication of his book Against Eurocentrism, I want to highlight a key point. This has been touched on again, but while this book Against Eurocentrism is nothing if it's not a passionate critique of modernity, Euromodernity, and of its associated gatekeeper ideologies that guard ever so tenaciously over it, of patriarchy, of anthropocentrism, of Eurocentrism, of capitalism, nevertheless he urges that we come together to form a collective social enterprise in order to transcend these gatekeepers, so that in the interest of global humanity, we may all advance to a better future. And as you put it, quote, to state the crux of the matter, the rejection of Eurocentrism as offered here is not intended to supplant it with an equally strident Asiacentrism, but with the larger, more accurate vision of the collective, if unevenly distributed, wisdom of the human race, within which latter-day European knowledge occupies a distinct, if not always a primary space. And in an email he wrote, since 1987, after a fateful academic retreat at Oxford, I started questioning my Eurocentric heritage of thinking in all domains, in particular the ideas bequeathed by Locke, Smith, and Marx, and inch by inch, this led to a revaluation of all inherited paradigms, resulting ultimately in the questioning of modernist science, nation state, civil society, etc. Today, 2 decades later, I consider anthropic society to be an organic entity where religion, science, and everyday life can coexist as they did in all traditional societies for millennia, without undue contradiction or conflict. Indeed, to mutual gain and advantage, it has led to a new appreciation for the traditional wisdom of our ancient forebears, drawn from all cultures. And it's this wider picture, one which rejects universalism as but Western civilizational values, and instead posits a kind of pluriversality. And this lies at the base of all the work that I do as well, and his writings have sincerely inspired me in my own endeavors. As we've also heard, and as we all know, Rajani is a prolific poet, churning out poems on a seemingly almost daily basis. He's probably sent me hundreds in the last decade, but I would like to share a couple with you. I think his pluriversal posture is beautifully captured in a 28 poem, left, right, good, evil, us, them, east, west, men, women, black, white, are all as day to night, binaries that reap their toll, serve but to thwart the goal of perspicacity. But the truth is not the part, be it science or art, the truth, ye artless battlers, the truth, ye saber rattlers, the truth, ye errant prattlers, in raw veracity, is the ineluctable whole. Yes, the truth is inexpugnable and whole. And finally, I particularly like the self-confessed contradiction, the existential contradiction that emerges in this particular poem entitled Ode to Empire. Wars without pause, pride without cause, occupations free of laws, mass murder just because. No contrition, no remorse, all a prosaic matter of course. Where self-critique is heresy, where the scope for apostasy, not democracy, not autocracy, but Erzat's realm of hypocrisy. It's the rule of the hypocrite, where the human soul is split by bad faith and suborned wit, possessed of every human sense, save the hallowed grace of conscience, forged their gaudy Taj Mahals, palisades, and gilded halls, swathed in dun blood and sweat of an entire world's precariat. So it is, and so it was, endless scourge without a pause. Debauchery will stalk the land where guilt is writ on every hand, yet still think it blessed to live in dank bosom of Western sieve. Oh, what a mutable parody can frame its sordid asymmetry. So with that, I thank you from the bottom of my heart, Rajani, for your inspiration and for your unrelenting critiques with which I have so much sympathy. Thank you.
Thank you so much, John, for coming.
Thank you, John. That was beautiful. And thank you for reading that poem. That's one of my favorites.
Great.
Wonderful. Up next, if I may ask Professor Kavi Raj from Columbia University to say a few words. Professor, the floor is yours if you can unmute.
Thanks, Rajani, for inviting me to this. I think I shall be brief, but it's hard for me to be brief because we've been in a strange way together for such a long time. Rajani and I go back to JNU. I think we were selected by the same selection committee, and we joined probably in the same week. JNU, which I think, as Rajani remembers, a wonderfully vibrant place. Maybe that, we are also deluded partly by our memory, because, anything which goes back into the past becomes more and more enchanting. But I still feel that, there was something which was very vibrant. Raja and I, we had no connection before. He came from Delhi, I came from Kolkata. But we discovered a strange accidental connection. Rajani was a great admirer of Levi-Strauss. I didn't know very much about Levi-Strauss except the name, but I was steeped in Althusser because I wanted to find a way out of a certain kind of Marxism, in which I grew up. And I thought that Althusser actually gave me a way of remaining a Marxist, but not holding on to most of the ideas that Marxists around me had. So I think he gave me a peculiar kind of freedom. Anyway, I think I've not been in touch with Rajani in all these years. We were together in 1971. But we have had a kind of interruptive conversation. I think when I was in England, we got in touch again. I think Rajani also came and visited us. And after I came to the United States, we have also been in touch off and on. Rajani, I just wanted to tell you a couple of things from my experience, because the more I look at your stuff, I haven't actually read it very carefully. So that's why I said that I didn't want to make a formal presentation. But I'm deeply surprised, just as I was surprised when I came to JNU and found there was so much that was similar in our thinking. I'm still struck by that today. I totally accept your critique of Eurocentrism. I'm also myself involved to some extent in that. Our modes of coming to that critique are somewhat different, but I think they're very parallel. I just wanted to share 2 or 3 thoughts with you. The first one, because we all have to find refuge in this world, because if we agree with everything that you say about the world, which I do, it is very important to save ourselves. And one thing that you did not mention, but I'm sure you would agree with me, is of course, alternative thinking, poetry, very much. But I also felt that, one thing which actually creates an impenetrable bubble around you in which you can save yourself from this world temporarily is music. I'm sure you would agree with that. Most people here, I think, would agree with that, that what this world makes us forget is to be with yourself. And one of the easiest way of being with yourself and discovering that feeling is music, which I really like. I'm also slightly fortunate in the sense that I have my wife sings, so quite often I'm wrapped in music that way. Secondly, Rajani, I would like to present this to you and also to other friends here. I'm a Bengali, and I grew up in a Bengali medium school, had a Bengali education. For nearly 40 years, I actually didn't write anything very much in Bengali. But during the COVID imprisonment, I wrote out 8 essays, not on Marx, on what we have done to Marx in India and in West Bengal. So the title of the book is Marx. In Bengali, it is Marx o Sotyer Sondhan, which means, Marx o Shopner Shorger Sondhan, which is Marx and the Search for Paradise. And the book essentially argues that I was attracted to Marxism because I thought that Marxists were searchers for paradise. Because paradise essentially meant a world which was unstained by suffering. But I argue in the book that if that is true, then we cannot ignore people who have also searched for paradise before us. We are not the first intelligent people in the history of the world. And we should look at the history of religious thought, not all of it, but history of religious thought, where religious thought has actually tried to overcome suffering in different ways. So much of the book is about that. And I also felt, this is something which I particularly wanted to share with you, Rajani, individually, that when I wrote in Bangla, it is a very different experience. Language is not intellectual. Language is, apart from being intellectual, language is haptic. When an English word occurs in the world, I don't hear it. When a Bengali word occurs in the world, I not merely hear it, I actually feel it on my skin. So it's actually touch-like, haptic in that sense. And what I found very interesting is that when I go into that world, I'm wrapped in that world. I also discover, I don't know how you would respond to it, that we overestimate the extent to which the life world is colonized by the world that you and I criticize. The moment you go into a language like that, a language like Bengali or Hindi or Urdu, I think you find an unfractured world, which does not live outside. It lives strangely. It lives inaccessibly, but also accessibly in the sense that all that you have to do is to go into that world, to read Gali or Tagore or somebody like that. And you find that world also, gradually sort of wrapping itself around that. I found, for instance, in my book, I make a point which is very similar to the point that you make about women. I couldn't agree with you more that, women should be allowed to run the world. But I also found that, Bengalis were worshippers of Krishna. The deity that the worship is an androgynous deity, Radha and Krishna together, but it's always Radha Krishna. And it's never Krishna Radha. No Bengali would ever say Krishna Radha. The Bengali would always spontaneously say Radha Krishna, right? So I find a lot of that, to be very helpful. Finally, I wanted to end by saying that I felt that there's something that I found in Marxism. My Marxism is very heterodox, as you know. In fact, I don't think Marx was very good at understanding the state and things like that. But there are two things which I wanted to say, which is from thinking about Marxism through Bengali. In Bengali, we use the term Sondhan, which is search, for two things. We say that somebody who searches for the truth is in Sotyer Sondhan. Shattu is truth, but truth in a Gandhian sense. Shattir Shandhan. But when somebody also thinks of something in imagination, we call it Kalpana Shandhan. Kalpana is also a Shandhan. So I think what it gives us, this kind of thinking that you and I both agree on, and the thought that we've been searching for a very long time. I think they are a combination of these two searches, in the search for truth, so that we understand the world in which we live, and we stand on firm ground of facts and critical analysis of facts. But then we float in the air in the sense that we can say that if these are the facts, these facts can be imaginatively extrapolated into the future, into time, in many different ways. And so I think
Professor Kaviraj, in speaking of time,
yeah,
we're
so
trying to wrap up.
I wanted to finish there, and I wanted to thank you for developing radicalism in a way which stitches together this critique of reality and the exercise of imagination. So finally, I thank you for being yourself.
Thank you. Wonderful. Up next, I have Professor Sandy Darity from Duke University. Professor, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Brother Fidel. I would just like to say that we're in the midst of a period of tremendous loss. And one of the elements of loss is the opportunity to share food and drink with the assembled group here. And it's a testament to Rajani's contributions, the community that has come together tonight to celebrate him. I know that when Anwar mentioned food and drink, I was thinking that the last time that I saw him prior to the onset of the pandemic was having a meal in Durham, North Carolina. And I cherish the moments breaking bread with you, Rajani, where we've had the opportunity to have some amazing conversations, amazing for me anyway, that have registered deeply with my thinking. But we've also experienced some literal loss in the moment of the pandemic, and one of the most recent people to leave us was the critical theorist Bell Hooks. And I hope you'll take this in the right spirit, because this is intended to be a powerful compliment. I think of you as the Bell Hooks of the economics profession. You are our voice of conscience. You are an individual whose courage and integrity has transcended the penalties that you've had to face, both personally and professionally, for taking the kind of perspective and stand that you have in our field. And you have been a fervent advocate of resisting normal science and economics. So for all of these reasons, including personal friendship, I just have tremendous admiration for what you have done and for what you are continuing to do. And I'd like to salute you.
Thank you so much. Thank you.
Thank you, Sandy. Up next, I have a recorded message from one of Rajani's former student, Melanie Hogan, who's a filmmaker from Australia. And it took a little bit of work to get this clip to work properly. It was technically challenging for me. So I'm going to go ahead and play it. I'll actually share the screen so you can see it.
Hi, my name is Melanie Hogan and I'm from Sydney, Australia. I was a student of Dr. Kanth's when I was in second year at UNSW studying economics, and I crossed his path because I selected a subject called An Alternative Approach for Economics. I think Raj is someone who is a light for people who want to think differently and question things. He introduced his students to people like Vandana Shiva, who is also iconoclastic like him. And we all greatly benefited from being stretched with our thinking. And he has done that prolifically throughout his life. I want to thank Raj personally for highlighting to me the values of Indigenous peoples around the world. I would say he definitely planted that seed in me to have a look in my own country of Australia. And from that, I went and lived with Indigenous people and became very close to Indigenous people in Australia, and even worked together on a film to try to teach Australians about Indigenous values, so that as a nation we could actually heal and grow in a more fair and wise way. So I wish you all the best, Raj, and I thank you for all your wonderful thinking and sharing of those thoughts throughout the decades. Bye from Australia.
That was wonderful. Up next, I have Professor James Galbraith from the University of Texas' Austin, who's joining us right now. Jamie, the floor is yours.
Thanks very much. And we're very much at the toward the end of the proceedings, and at the moment when, in the immortal words of a man I knew well, a former late Congressman Morris Udall, everything has been said, but not everybody has actually said it. I asked to be put at the end of the proceedings because I genuinely have no speech to give. I'm here basically just for three reasons. First, because particularly as this is a session of the Allied Social Sciences Association, as Steve Keen noted, it is important to support all forms of subversion and rebellion against the conventional and mainstream economics. Secondly, I'm here in what I can only describe as a Kanthian spirit to greet and encourage our friends, many of whom are here, and it's important particularly in the circumstances we face, to do that. And third, of course, to salute Rajani and to thank Fadil for organizing and hosting this session. And the only other thing, that's all I have to say, but the only other thing is that I have to dissent just in a very modest way from the comment that Sandy Darity made about sharing food and drink with you, Raj, because my experience of eating with you was that you're practically the most difficult person in the world to eat with. And so I think that should be on the record. I see that I'm not the only one to have this experience. So, but as character flaws go, that one's modest in comparison to all of your other highly noted virtues. Thanks very much. It's nice to be here.
I prefer fasting to feasting, Jamie. That's what it is. Thank you. You're very right.
Thank you, Jamie, for being with us here today. Up next, I have a recorded message from a Bollywood celebrity, and I'll share the screen with you, and you'll see who he is in a second. Here's the message.
Hello, everyone. This is Ravi Shergill. I'm a singer-songwriter from India. I've had the good fortune of knowing Professor Rajani Kanth now for close to 10 years, in which time I've come to realize the gravity and the depth of his elegant critique of Eurocentrism. It's provided to me personally a way of understanding and framing, and in part also alleviating the many pathologies that our global civilization finds itself in. I think anyone who's serious about finding another way than the one that got us here to resolve this mess would do well to give Rajani's critique some due consideration. I think through honoring him and his life's work, in some ways we are honoring the best part of this global civilization that we are all a part of. He has contributed a great deal to my own understanding of our own place in history, in cosmos. I hope he's done the same for a number of other people. I think he's one of those people whose work is going to find ever more resonance as this crisis escalates. I wish him all the very best. He's been a fantastic human being and a counselor of sorts in my life's many travails. And he's always helped out. He's always had a kind word and a sage counsel to offer. I cannot say enough about the academic brilliance and the sheer human heart or the vitality of him as a complete person. I wish him all the very best. I have nothing but eternal gratitude and I hope everlasting love for you, Rajani. And I just hope that I've contributed a little bit in the much deserved recognition and appreciation of your life's work. Here's wishing you all the very best. May you shine evermore. Thank you.
And that was a recorded message from Ravi Sergil. Up next, I have a written note from Professor Ravi Batra, who is unfortunately unable to join us today. He's been dealing with some health issues over the last few weeks, and yet he took the time to send this brief note, which I'll read on his behalf. This is from Ravi Batra. I have known Professor Kanth for many years now, and I can say that he is a superb economist, sharp and smart. He has contributed to the profession with his writing, which is always grounded in solid understanding of the subject, but also very importantly, in a deeply felt humanitarianism. The ultimate purpose of economics is to help ensure that all people are rewarded fairly according to their productivity, and that minimum needs of food, shelter, medical care, and education are available to all. Professor Kanth has never lost sight of these principles in his multifaceted work. Above all, he has been a great father to his children that he loves deeply. I wish him continued good health, happiness, and success in his future endeavors. Signed, Ravi Batra. That brings us to the end of the formal part of the contributions, and I'd like to open it up to comments, greetings, contributions, or questions from anybody in the audience. And I'd like to invite all the panelists here to join us also on camera if you're able to. So the floor is open. John, go ahead. I see your hand, and you can raise your digital hand so I can see who's. For the floor.
Yeah,
John,
I've got a question that's been exercising my mind for the last year, and I've written a piece on it. And my question is this: we talk about Eurocentrism and we talk about racism as if somehow they're different things. Are they really just one and the same thing?
Is that a question for me, or are you addressing?
Yeah, for you, Rajani, but for anyone else who wants to chime in.
Actually, honestly, I think the way I look at Eurocentrism is somewhat different from the way in which I don't see it as some sort of an ethnocentrism of a particular kind, but instead I say, in fact, my understanding of Eurocentrism is that it is really what we understand today as European modernism. And those are the things that I really pick on. In fact, I don't think in my definition of Eurocentrism I even mentioned racism, but it's rather the attitude. It's more the philosophical approach, the way it conceives the world, the way it conceives ontology, the way it conceives human beings, that is fundamentally fatally flawed. And therefore, it's misconceived from the start, it's ill-conceived from the start, it's misanthropic, but in some strange way, as if unconsciously so, and yet it seems to fit a certain agenda, for a certain will. So this may come as a bit of a surprise, but if you read my definitions of Eurocentrism, which I offer in various parts, racism is not really, at the essence, but rather it is what modernism has done. What has destroyed the world is not racism, but modernism, because when it's adopted even by the races that are minorities in this world, it destroys them as well. because it's fundamentally a misconceived way. It's building, artificial expectations. It's focusing on asocial individualism, which I really believe is the essence of the collapse of societies everywhere that adopts modernism. It is such an innovation in history. You see, countries could choose capitalism, but you will notice that hardly any non-European culture has ever chosen asocial individualism. It's impossible because their culture is so strong. It's impossible for them to conceive of individualism outside of community, outside of some sort of a tribal affiliation. Outside of that, it's only Europe and Europe alone that was able to break individualism, take it outside of society to the point where Margaret Thatcher could say society is just the plural of individual. Now, this is incomprehensible to anybody who's non-European in culture. And I say it flatly. So you see, my understanding is really different. So of course, racism is part of, in fact, of imperialism and so on. Even that I don't see as fundamentally Eurocentrism. In fact, I'm trying to remember now because I've been so besotted by compliments unnerve me and they're bad for my soul and they certainly disrupt my thinking, so I can barely put my thoughts together. And I've never had so many compliments. I'm more used to the other kind of stuff, the opposite, right? So that I'm perfectly happy with. It sort of inspires me, but this lays me low. So all these kind words have me turn into silly putty, So I lose my thread. But let me define in the way in which I think I've defined it in my works. Eurocentrism stands for 2 or 3 things. One, let me see where. Yeah, it is the adoption of materialism as a philosophy. It's the adoption of a notion of progress that is self-serving, but also based on materialist principles, such as per capita income or whatever the augmentation of wealth algorithm turns out to be. It is the use of state powers. Even John Stuart Mill could say that it's perfectly all right to use force to make people free. Think of that. John Stuart Mill, the patron saint of liberty, can say it is perfectly all right to use the state to force people to be free. Now notice if you pick that idea up, it justifies what George Bush said he was doing when he went into Iraq, right? It was only spreading democracy. So what I'm trying to say is that the actual definition of Eurocentrism that I use includes ideas like this. I'm trying to remember the rest of it. Again, as I said, I've been laid low by the favorable comments that have been made here. But all right, so I think I've identified one, the materialism of it. Second, a self-serving notion of progress. Third, the asocial individualism. Yeah, that individualism. Now, individuals exist in all societies. It's a myth that the Europe created that. No, the individuals exist, have always existed. But an individualism that is placed above society, that is the contribution of Europe. And that is what becomes totally destructive. That's what builds those egos, That's what, and also setting up an adversarial society permanently. That's really what a modernist society is. You're permanently divided. And 51 can trump 49 and you call it democracy. This is all nonsense. And you can read the newspapers in 1920 or 2020 or 2120 and they'll be full of the same things because you have set a society up which competes against itself, where adversity is seen as a good thing, where competition is seen as a good thing, forgetting that these are all rather new concepts in history. This is not how, and again, I go back always, not to a Garden of Eden, but really existing tribal society. They still exist in spite of the fact that we've been trying to exterminate them every way possible. The Australian Aboriginals still exist. And in fact, my student, Melanie Hogan, whom you heard from, lived with them and made this amazing film that I recommend you all watch. It's called Kanyini, K-A-N-Y-I-N-I. And she shows to this day, they've maintained some of the things that I'm talking about. So I'm not idealizing. This is not the noble savage that Europeans pick up as part of conducting their own ideological struggles at home. But this is reality, that we come from a tribal past. It is the most integrated society imaginable. It is not adversarial. It doesn't have a state that stands above it. It doesn't talk about rights or any of that nonsense. Instead, it is communitarian. It's based on kinship and extended kinship. That's what a tribe is. And my argument really is that is the foundation the closest we can come as a human species to some form of contentment. And once that is destroyed, we're just marooned, And what modernism does is, and Eurocentrism is therefore the ultimate paradigm of the rejection of the organic nature of society, instead building up artificial things. I give an example of liberty, democracy, equality. Oh, these are all high-sounding, fine values. But if I gave you a pound of food when you're hungry and 2 pounds of liberty, which would you choose? If I gave you a pound of conviviality and a pound of democracy, which would you choose? So it's sort of inherently abstract ideas, and they become a cover for concealing. For instance, the word needs never appears in economics textbook. It's always wants. So always distracting us with abstract ideals, as if we can declare any principle we want, invent ourselves any way we want. And so what is a modern society? Everybody fighting for impossible ideals that simply cannot be realized. Whereas I'm saying we are close cousins to the bonobo and the chimps. We share about 98% of our genes. Why do we think that we can become angels or gods and live in a perfect utopia? This is utter, complete nonsense. Right? We have to understand that we have limitations. And one of the key things that Eurocentrism leaves out, and I give you explanations, I won't give it now, but I've written books on these things, that instincts are left out. If you study animals, you can use instincts. If you study human beings, you cannot use instincts anymore. Why? Because we are supposed to be descended from God, right? And therefore, we are immune from that. We are not animals. And I'm saying that's exactly what we are. So Eurocentrism, what is the fundamental folly of Eurocentrism? Not understanding who we are as human beings. From that initial mistake, all kinds of errors follow. And that's so you understand that my definition has very little to do with imperialism or racism, even though those are manifest practical things that arise when you have a certain system in place. So I hope I've clarified that I'm not talking about ethnocentrism at all as an issue.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you, Rajani and John. Jamie, I saw you raise your digital hand earlier. The floor is yours.
Well, I realize we're at time, and I had a follow-up question to John's, which might just absorb quite a lot of time. But it is isn't Eurocentrism really Anglocentrism? It sounds to me that the guy you have it in for is John Locke. Given that the British have now separated themselves from Europe, I wonder if you're being a little hard on the Continentals as opposed to the true villains, who are actually the English.
I'm not sure who the question is addressed to. Is it addressed to John? John, I think it's your question.
No, it's really.
I was rather hoping it was yours, Rajani.
John asked you whether racism was Eurocentrism, and I'm asking you whether Eurocentrism isn't really Anglocentrism. You mentioned John Stuart Mill, and I would seems to me that the tradition you're dealing with is primarily English rather than continental.
Actually, no, because in the way I define Eurocentrism, I think you're right if you're thinking of Eurocentrism as a form of ethnocentrism, but that's not what I'm talking about. I've been saying that Eurocentrism is really my term for European modernity. And European modernity covers all the tribes of Europe, not just the Anglo-Saxons or the Anglo-Normans or the Germans, or whatever. They're all covered by it. So my term Eurocentrism is all about what I abbreviated as EM, which is European modernism. And therefore, it more or less corresponds to what you would understand today as the ills of Western capitalism. So that's what it's about. Now, of course, in its historical unfolding, you have empire, you have racism, but those I see as really secondary to the primary gestalt switch, conceiving of society completely differently. In fact, there's a great poem, and the poetry I find illuminates so much more, says it faster, better, deeper. Oliver Goldsmith has a fantastic poem called The Deserted Village. If anybody has not read it, read that. It has all the sociology you need, all the economic. It's the great transformation of Polanyi, but written beautifully. It's showing you how An organic society was broken up completely and destroyed by the profit motive, by individualism, by this sense of setting up everything as an adversarial mode, by what you would call capitalism. I try not to use those terms because they have been used. I do what I do because most of you guys do what you do. So I've separated myself from that line because there's tons of books on capitalism, millions, thousands of books. So I'm looking at it from a much wider angle, saying let's take society, let's take culture and look at it that way. And again, I recommend that point because it shows you how, and this is why utopia arises. If you notice, the utopian tendency of writing is a reaction to the fact that society has been destroyed, and everybody's lamenting it. And the Deserted Village is an extraordinarily eloquent poem lamenting this destruction, ecological, sociological, cultural, that took place. So that is what I'm trying to get at. Not just, ruling other people or pitting one race against the other. I'm not saying they're not important, my God, of course they are. But that's not what I am trying to focus on. I'm saying there's something more fundamental. You have to go beyond that and below that. What is the fundamental philosophical mode in which that whole system could be practiced? And that is what, for instance, the Chinese today are as Eurocentric, in my definition, as America. They're modernist, you see. And therefore, they also approach problems in a certain way, which is common. So that's why I don't take, how shall I put it, an ethnocentric view of Eurocentrism. Although I realize even Wallerstein wrote about it as simply, the chauvinism of the West. No, that's not what I mean by it at all. I'm talking about modernity as a lethal, noxious philosophy and practice. So I hope I've clarified that.
Thank you, Rajani, and thank you, Jamie. And I see some comments in the chat box here. I'd like to invite you to take a look at those as well.
I keep repeating that my understanding of Eurocentrism is what you would understand as, look, the Frankfurt School understood my problematic, which is that modernism creates a desperate lack of meaning. Meaning disappears, everything else appears. It is that meaning that organic society gave people. Whether it's tribal society, or even some pre-capitalist, the feudalism was a terrible system, but yet it was organic. There were communal rights, reciprocity that do not exist when you say we're all islands, we function on our own, and you have your own personal objectives, and the community is secondary. So all these notions destroy meaning in human life. The Frankfurt School made it problematic. Say that it still exists because I'm not making it up. You can go today to Australia, and I just told you a film has been made. All those Garden of Eden myths that you think are myths, but they're not myths. I mean, of course, the garden, I don't mean literally, but figuratively, they're real. I mean, this is a happy society. No, women are not complaining about men being dominant because their men are not dominant. Do you know they don't even stay in one place? They move every other. So every notion of modernity puts forward the nation state, all right, rights in the kind of way we define them, all the adversarialism, we're fighting each other all the time. Do you think that makes us a happy society? And then they start to fall apart. In fact, most tribal societies break into empires. All right, this is a common progression or regression. So that happens all the time. That doesn't mean that they didn't have certain virtues to begin with. So to point out a transitional tribal society and say, oh, look, they've got all sorts of problems is not fair, because I'm saying that the original tribal, of which there's plenty of anthropology, and Aboriginals still exist to prove that. And there you can't transpose modernist ideas of gender important in a more general, it is important to you and I, but not important to, let's say, the audience that's listening to us. I think let's invite some other comments. But I'll make my point again. I am not talking about ethnocentrism at all. I'm talking about, I use different language, that Eurocentrism means that it is Europe that first invented modernity of the kind that we've all accepted without understanding what it is. We take it for granted. And when I went and asked them, I said, is there one single thing Indian about India? And they said, what do you mean? I said, is your parliamentary system Indian? Of course not. Is your military organized in some Indian fashion? No, it's British. Is your legal system Indian? No, that's English common law. Is your educational system Indian? No, Lord Macaulay. So in other words, every single thing was foisted upon them by the outside, and they're unaware of it. So this is what modernity does. It blinds us so we don't understand our own shackles and we think we're this independent, proud, free, and so on. It's complete nonsense. So modernity is the disease and it is the loss of meaning. And I'm saying that until you take care of that, it is a destructive, toxic virus. And if you let this go on, expanding modernism because you think it gives you freedom, equality, and all the lies that have been said about it for 200 years, until we drop all that fantasy, we will continue to go down a bad way. I say what I think is true based on, as I'm trying to be as objective as I can with my limitations, and that is enough for me. If you don't like what I do or that's fine. I can live with. I have no problem with disagreement or In fact, I would be a little uneasy if somebody said, "Hey, you know what? You're completely okay." Without saying, "Wait a minute, are you sure?" So my approach is not to seek agreement. What is agreement anyway? Agreement over what? I mean, this is society. We are driven by so many different forces, and so why should agreement itself be an ideal of some kind? I don't even see it as important. It's not even important.
I'd like to invite Carlos with his digital hand raised there, and then Jamie, I think, had a comment.
Okay. Yeah.
Yeah.
First of all, I'd just like to register. Thank you very much. Also, Jamie, for me not being the last comment. I really appreciate that. But first of all, my name is Carlos. I'm on leave from the World Bank at the Harvard Engineering Department. Most of my work is in AI regulation. But I think gratitude is something you have to show in public. That's what my father said. So, Professor Rajani, thank you very much. It's an honor and a privilege to be even talking to you, let alone in front of this august panel here. I believe in the lack of meaning, of the loss of meaning, right? The disenchantment of society.
Yes.
That is, I'm with you there, and. In fact, this idea that we're dueling experts here, it's almost like I'm looking at this again. As coming from the bank on the international development side, one of the big criticisms that I always found myself fighting against myself with the Eurocentrism of capital, right? This idea that it's kind of almost like money dissolves social ties. And I'm not sure if that is the way to think about it, but I was wondering, now that we're getting a more interdependent world, it's kind of like this illusion that we can live alone because we have enough money to sustain ourselves, and kind of the pandemic showed that everything is kind of interconnected. I was wondering, do you think that we may have now a space to kind of like rebuild, as it's being said, the Great Reset and so forth? And if you could say advise Mr. Malpass, say for example, on what how to think about some of these things. Do you think that central bank digital currencies or centralizing it back to the government, this idea of money? I don't know. Any insights? I come for wisdom, sir. And I'm sorry to when we're homaging you, asking you to work. It's not correct.
No.
Thank you.
Not at all. In fact, if there's any other questions also, since we only have, 5 minutes, if there's any other questions, I can take them and answer them together. Otherwise, it will be the last question. What do you say, Father?
I saw digital hands from Jamie and Steve Keen earlier. So if you could please.
If I can have those questions, I'll answer them in one answer.
We'll have them together.
Yeah.
Jamie, go ahead.
I didn't have anything in particular to say, but I will respond to the chat comment from Addie, that she's leaving with the sense that she can stand up against conventional economics. And I just want to warn that this is still a very dangerous thing to do. So make sure that you have strong allies and good cover before you venture too strongly into the public domain. What you're dealing with here are a group of old survivors who are scattered dinosaurs of the profession who are hanging together out of sheer necessity, because otherwise we would have nobody else to relate to. I just hope that there are more coming along and that they figure out how to find a survival niche as we have done.
Thanks, Jamie. Steve, you're next.
It's actually a bit of an accident, but I'll carry on anyway. When I was hearing the conversation, I was thinking of the works I've read in evolutionary biology, which imply that a lot of what we're seeing is actually just a product of the actual process of evolution. And on that front, on a bit of a interesting read, there's a book called Sudden Origins, I think by Jesse Schwartz, and he points out quite a remarkable aspect of evolution, that evolution occurs in the recessive genes. And if you have imagined having a species of fish which don't have teeth, then you have the development of teeth occurs in the recessive genes, and it's only when you get two organisms, one male, one female, where the recessive gene is the only gene, therefore the male has teeth and the female has teeth, then they find each other and they can breed, and suddenly, that's what's called sudden origins, you have a species of fish with teeth versus all the rest don't have teeth. And then part of the process of actually continuing the development of that species is they get shunned by the fish without teeth. So in this essential way, partly, and I hate to say it, but this is the evolution thing, that sense of shunning, which is the foundation of racism, is something which is actually part of the evolutionary process that gives to the diversity of life. Now, we are the first species intelligent enough to understand that. We should be doing something to reverse its deleterious impact, which we haven't done. And that leads to the other issue that I take from other end of science, the great filter. Why we're the only species whose existence, intelligent species, and only planet with life we know about. Maybe this whole process lends in us screwing ourselves completely by using the evolutionary remnants of fossil fuels and so on, and wiping our species out. And that to me is the real challenge. To avoid that is the human challenge that we should be really focusing upon, the heterodox economics in the future.
Well, I think you've said it all, Steve, so I don't think I can comment on that. But let me take the first question that came. I've forgotten, I don't think I was given the name of the gentleman.
My apologies, Carlos, sir.
Yes, Mr. Carlos, you see the interconnectedness you speak about, if it were voluntary, then it would be understandable, but the interconnectedness of the world, at least for the last 400 years, has not been voluntary. It was imposed. It was deliberately imposed from the outside. People were forced into these, trading areas or whatever zones you want to call them. And that is not really interconnectedness. That is not really interdependence of the kind that you would think. So yes, in fact, I don't even support globalization because it simply means an extension of the hegemonic powers of the people who are already out there doing the same thing. So instead, what we need is for communities at the micro level to try and disengage from this modernist monster. Whether you call it capitalism, you can use your own terms, but I use different terms because I do say more. It's not just the economics of it, the politics of it, but also the culture, the disenchantment. You use that phrase, the disenchantment of the world. It is very real. And I don't mean it necessarily in the same sense of demystification, which is a different issue, but really taking meaning out of life. That is what European modernity achieved. And you know what? That was not achieved in other cultures that accepted capitalism, but they did not allow meaning to disappear. That is what makes non-European capitalist society completely different culturally from the heartland of European capital. And that's why being an economist, knowing economics is not enough. What do they know of economics? Only economics know. They need to know other things. They need to understand culture. They need to understand anthropology and society. And then you get a much deeper vision of the harm that has been done. And it's not just empire, it's not racism. It is the fundamental destruction of the concept of who we are as human beings. So I am addressing a much, much larger thing. And it doesn't matter to me who agrees with me or disagrees with me. I speak what I believe to be verifiable. I can't prove anything. We know that there's no logic of proof. But yes, it can be verified, and you don't need to go read a book to verify it. I say things that I believe intuitively make sense. And if I have any appeal at all, and I tell you, I've lectured all over the world, I've never had one person stand up and say, you are talking rot, okay? It has never happened. Why? Because as far as possible, I'm saying things that they can relate to, that they can understand as human beings. So this is what I'm saying, that there is such a thing as a species being. Even Marx understood that. And I use similar things. There is a species being, but it's been misread by modernists, misread by this current regime. They don't know what human beings are like. What in my little short presentation, I told you what we are about, okay? And once you see it that way, the world is different. We don't need nation states. We don't need large interconnections. We don't need all those things, right? If you ask yourself, what is it I need to survive as a human being? You don't say, I need a nation state, I need to be part of GATT, I need to be part of WEF. No, these are all imposed artificial institutions by elites who benefit from that. And it's not necessarily true that it trickles down. So we have to think backwards now, all right? Not forwards as the imagery goes, but really backwards. Go back to micro communities. Bring back, I mean, culture, it takes thousands of years for cultures to be built, but they can be destroyed like that as soon as Euromodernism takes over. So I see it happening in India, right? It's not the same India it was 25 years ago before the neoliberals took over. And they destroy culture first because culture is the barrier. And it's not reactionary as people think. In fact, the left, the greatest mistake of the left was turning over culture to the right. And they took it over, misappropriated it, misnamed it, and abused it. But culture is real, it's made by people, and it's always organic, all right? So tribal cultures are all organic cultures. It is real. And you won't talk to me there about women's rights or work. The concept does not exist. They're a community in the same way as within a family, a real organic family, not the modernist family, not a marriage, which is a contract with a piece of paper, but in a communal sense. Look at tribal society, they function very, very well. And hardly anybody there, unless you have modernized the guy and given him an education in Oxford or Cambridge, they're not going to say, oh, we are alienated, or that we are this, that, and the other. So these are all false notions. And these were well understood when the transition was taking place in Europe and lamented by philosophical traditions, much of existentialism, much of what they call the romantic reaction, they called it, the protest, came from that. Goldsmith is one of them, but Keats and Coleridge, all these people understood the damage to the human psyche, all right, and the social psyche that was taking place. Whereas economists only focus on, as you know, right, other kinds of variables. So all I'm doing is supplying the missing domain. And I think that is where we are located. We are cultural beings, always. From the beginning, so the materialism is, first of all, materialism is wrong. Right? We understand that it's bad morals, it's bad theology, it's bad philosophy, it's also bad science, right? We know that through quantum physics. Take a living cell and a dead cell. To the materialist, they're both the same, and yet we know they're not the same. What's the difference between a living cell and a dead cell? For a materialist, it's the same. For Marx himself, it would have been the same, but he's wrong. Why? Because the living cell has vital energy. Can they explain vital energy in a philosophy of materialism? No. Can scientific materialism explain vital energy? No, because that's what we call life. It is consciousness. So consciousness becomes the hard problem of Western philosophy. Of course, they can't solve it because they've set up a false paradigm. But I'm saying reject all that nonsense, all right? Learn more. And quantum physics is actually teaching us things, validating things. And you can't blame Marx. He followed classical physics, Newtonian physics, which we now know is only a subset of a much larger, much broader, much deeper, more correct physics. So it is primitive physics that was practiced by those early, critical thinkers. And we have to move beyond that. And there is a new world there. And it's opened up by, in fact, Amit Goswami and I, and he's probably one of the most prominent advocates of quantum theorizing, quantum activism, he calls it. And it's much broader based. It brings the human being into it. And we know now that consciousness is primary, that we live, in a possible universe that itself part of a set of potentialities. The very fact of an observer effect, as they speak, that we are important. We bring the human being back into the equation of life. Whereas, it sort of disappeared in the classical science. We became atoms, where everything is dead and inert, life is meaningless. And those are the things I'm talking about. Meaning needs to be restored because we are human beings who seek meaning. We cannot live meaningless lives. That is why the suicides, that's why the mass shootings, that's why all the savagery you see. So that is my larger thesis. I didn't want to go into this because, as I said, I wasn't prepared. And that's why I can barely remember some of these things. But as I said, I've written on it, so please read them and don't misjudge me on the basis of this, that, or the other. But I thank you for the question. It's an excellent question.
Thank you, Rajani, and thank you everyone for your comments. I see one more digital hand raised, but I would like to ask of you to make it really very brief because we're past our
I would
time.
just like to thank Professor Kanth. I met him just a few years ago, and some of the intuition that I had about the critique that was forming in my head, I found support in some of the argument that he was making. So I'm still learning about his work, and I come from traditional economics background, and there was some discomfort, like, you know, in the kind of things that I was understanding, and he helped me create certain framework that I'm still evaluating and learning about. But I would like to extend my thanks for his courage and his passion and his compassion for humanity and for other aspects. Thank you.
It's good to see you, Sanjeev. I didn't expect you to be here. Thank you for coming.
Thanks.
Thank you, Sanjeev. And with that, I'd like to close this session by raising my digital hand. I'd like to invite you all to raise your digital hands as a form of clapping or or standing ovation. And thank you, Rajani, for your wisdom, for caring, for sharing, for your compassion, and for your mentorship over the years to so many people. Some are here and others are all over the world doing the right thing and fighting the good fight. Thank you again for joining us. It's been a pleasure hosting you all in this webinar virtual session. And I'd like to close the session, and we'll share the recording with you and others who are not able to join us today. Thanks again.
Thank you all. Very grateful. Thanks.
Have a good evening or good morning, depending on where you are.
Bye-bye. you.